Hi, good evening everyone, and welcome to Make Design Matter. Huge thanks to Heinz and all at Jessica and Wild for gifting us this space. I'm David Murray, Managing Director of Article 25, and we design and build schools and hospitals where they're needed most across the global south. And I just want to take a couple of minutes to say thanks to the BRE Trust as well, who are partners of Make Design Matter and help to make these talks happen. And then I'll pass over to B, who will introduce our main speaker tonight. And so you know as well, because we are this charity that's doing great work overseas, but we do absolutely need your support to help make design matter where it matters most. And we have a couple of great fundraising adventures coming up. So on the 27th of May, we've got 10 places on the Vitality 10K run, 4 spaces left to fill. So if anybody wants to come along and sign up tonight, please do come and find us. We're all wearing badges. And we've also got a wonderful cycling adventure across Tanzania, starting in Mpanda, finishing in Mbeya. It's just over 400 miles of cycling. We're going to visit a few schools along the way to understand how we might be able to retrofit disabled accessible space. And we'll finish at the Child Support Tanzania School, which is completing phase 2 of construction right now. So please do come and find us at any time tonight. We will tell you a bit more about what we're up to. But without any further ado, thanks so much again to Heinz and Jessica's, and pass over to B. Senewald. Thank you.
Hello, thanks for making your way over here to Clerkenwell tonight to hear James Mitchell, who founded Orkidstudio. Orkidstudio, I think, started in Scotland, and James, when I met him, was a lecturer at Glasgow School of Architecture and had grand ideas about designing and building a hospital in Zambia. And by good fortune, at the time, I was somewhat at loose ends and also enjoy very much designing hospitals. So we teamed up a bit on the design part of it, and then also a little bit on the construction. So James has since gone on, moved to Nairobi, is now centered in Nairobi, and has gone on to many more and bigger projects. The staff that I knew 3 years ago numbered 3. It's now 36 people, and they're building hospitals and also some other projects at a much larger scale. So James is going to talk about social enterprise, empowering people, and how to do design and build in Africa. James.
Thank you, B. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk broadly about our work, but largely around 3 things, and essentially the idea that we need local people with local solutions, and we need to deliver that at scale. So to begin with, Orkidstudio is founded on a very simple belief or simple mission, which is simply that everybody is entitled to, or everybody should have access to, healthy, safe, and dignified built environment. The way that we're trying to do that really comes back to how we look at cities, how we look at the way that countries like Kenya are developing. Now, when I say something like public health to you, I'm sure most people would think about some sort of medical context, maybe think about things like pollution that we see in the atmosphere, things that affect us at a large scale. I think that the biggest public health situation that we're facing in Kenya is the built environment. Africa's population is set to double in the next 30 years. Kenya alone, a country of 52 million people at the moment, is set to double in that same time as well. And we're going to see a huge amount of those people moving from rural to urban environments. Over 55% of Africa's population will live in cities by 2050. Of the population at the moment in Kenya, more than 75% of Kenyans are aged less than 30 years old. That's a massive, massive shift in demographic that is going to get older, and with better healthcare and better systems, are increasingly going to live longer and lead to this much, much bigger population. As a result, the amount of infrastructure that is needed is absolutely massive. 27 million housing units estimated. This is in Kenya alone. 12,000 schools, 3,300 health centers. How are we going to build all of that? Oh, that's gone one too many, sorry. One of the big challenges that we've got in looking at that mammoth scale of task is the huge shortage of professional designers, engineers, and construction professionals in this part of the world. Taking Africa as a whole, the US has 75 times more architects per person than, say, East Africa. So you have one architect for every 2,000 people in the US. There's one architect to every 130,000 in East Africa. Italy, I think, is one worth pointing out. They have one architect for every 400 people. A lot of architects in Italy.
Personal service.
Yeah, almost. We also see that manifesting itself right the way down to the artisans, to the skilled laborers on site. As a result of huge unemployment, we see a lot of people wanting to work in construction, but very, very few people that are actually adequately trained. Such that in Kenya, there's only 460,000 properly certified artisans to deliver 72 million housing units, or however many health centers, however many schools. What we see as a result in cities like Nairobi are scenes like this. We see huge divide between slightly wealthier housing and areas like this in Kibera slum, which are shanty buildings, really, really basic, an obvious manifestation of that lack of expertise. However, what a lot of people don't realize, because it's very rarely reported outside of Kenya, oops, sorry, this is not working very well. So that spoils my next slide. Major buildings are falling down on an almost monthly basis. We hear news stories of 6-story buildings, 10-story buildings collapsing. And these are buildings that are collapsing during construction or within a year or two of being complete. These are not 50-year-old buildings, 100-year-old buildings. Now, why is that happening? A big part of it is what I've just explained. It's the lack of expertise, particularly artisans able to meet modern methods of construction or any real quality of construction. But there's other forces at play. There's corruption. A lot of contractors cutting corners, trying to get their profit margins up, or even underbidding in the first place just to win a bid and then not able to deliver to the specification on site. Either way, it's a major, major challenge. So this is me, if you hadn't guessed. I thought I'd stop there, maybe just lighten it a little. I did lose a little weight after this, you'll see. I grew up in Scotland, as Bea said, just outside Glasgow. Managed to escape the accent. And I went to study architecture in Cardiff University. And when I was there, I was very fortunate to meet the woman here on the right, a girl called Julissa. And together, in our first year, we've had very similar beliefs or very similar ideas about what our profession was meant to do. We'd started on this course that we knew took 7 years, more than it takes to become a doctor. And we thought that as a result, that the buildings that we would be asked to design, the projects we might get opportunities to be a part of, would be reflective of a much bigger segment of the population than the one we encountered in our course. And so with that, we started to ask, well, what is the purpose of architecture? Who is architecture really for? Who actually benefits from buildings designed by architects? And it just so happened that in our first year of architecture school, we had a lecture where the lecturer explained to us that only 1% of the world's population live in buildings designed by architects. And I thought, wow, I thought it was going to be bad, but that's pretty horrendous. So from there, we went on and set up Orkidstudio as a small, not-for-profit, operating out of the UK, delivering small-scale design-build projects over a series of about 8 years. After that, we had been through university, we had gotten experience in practice, and we realized that actually the need was far greater than what we could deliver through this small organization alone. And so the last 2.5, 3 years has been focused on really scaling up and driving the work that we're doing through a social enterprise model, which is more of a for-profit model, and then certain elements where necessary are still done through the non-profit side. Back 2 is designed for everyone and to the city that I now call home. I should say Nairobi is actually a really great city. If you haven't been, I really recommend it. Very few people ever think to go on a holiday to Nairobi or to do anything in that part of the world. It's not just safari, although I can see lions and elephants and giraffe about 20 minutes from my house, which is quite nice. But it's a really vibrant place. It's an up-and-coming place. It's a place that, because of so much youth, we're seeing so much entrepreneurialism, so much energy. There's a lot of very well-educated Kenyans who have had opportunities either outside of Kenya or within the institutions that do exist there. And as a result, things are changing, but there are still massive, massive divide. This comes from a really fantastic website called Unequal Scenes. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you go on it. It's got various cities all over the world where you can just see the huge juxtaposition between the haves and the have-nots at an urban scale. And so recently we decided to do a bit of a study around some of the areas that surround our office in Nairobi. And these are all low-income settlements, informal settlements. And Nairobi is built almost 100% from 2 materials, stone and concrete. The concrete, I probably don't need to talk to you much about in terms of environmental credentials. The stone, we've already seen in the last 10 or 15 years a huge degradation in the quality of stone that's being quarried for construction. Buildings that were built 15, 20 years ago are built out of what I would call stone. It's hard to knock. I wouldn't want to drop it on my foot. The stuff that they're now using, probably still wouldn't want to drop it on my foot, but it's really, really crumbly. You can break it with your own hands, the corners. It's basically just compressed rubble. And if we keep building 27 million housing units, or the amount of infrastructure that's required out of these materials, we're going to leave Kenya in an absolutely dreadful position environmentally and climatically. We're also seeing really poor quality design, or in most cases, no design. Buildings like this is an incredibly typical scene where in this case it was actually the same developer built this sort of central atrium, if you can call it that, but it's incredibly dark, incredibly dank. Nothing about that is dignified for humans to live in. We also see no sense of planning at the urban scale. So in many cases, you'll see a developer who's built here intending these balconies to get a view, and somebody else will just put a blank wall right up next to it. There's no city plan, and there's no vision, and there's nobody to feed that vision. So what solutions are there? I'll start first with Orkidstudio and what we're trying to do. We have a pretty big, pretty audacious vision for what we want to do in this part of the world. The first part of it is the part that most of you will at least won't come as a surprise, and that's our design-build practice. So here we're providing a complete end-to-end design-build service for projects in the East Africa region. And occasionally in other countries, but really trying to focus down on where we work. By that I mean that we have in-house architects, structural engineers, MEP engineers, quantity surveyors. We're a registered general contractor. We do absolutely everything. The procurement, there's no other consultant or contractor required in the process. And a big part of that is trying to beat corruption, to make things much more transparent, much more efficient, keep costs down, and give our clients something to really trust in. Now, as we did that, we found, well, we can design, hopefully, great buildings. We can project manage them quite well. But one of the things we were actually struggling to do was to create great buildings. And the biggest reason was that we couldn't find carpenters, bricklayers, plumbers, electricians, and so on that actually could meet the standard that we were trying to hold them to. And so we have recently launched, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, a workforce skills training program in Nairobi, which is upskilling workforce in very key sort of low supply, high demand trades. And we're already seeing and reaping the benefits of that. We're also doing a lot of research, development and innovation, trying to understand, well, how can we build differently? There's a number of amazing material options available here which we just don't get, and importing them is not necessarily the solution. So what ideas can we come up with? What ways and construction methods can we develop? And then lastly, we're trying to actually tackle something at scale. The government in Kenya recently launched its new agenda called the Big Four Agenda. And one of the pillars, alongside things like healthcare, was housing, trying to get more people into housing. But at the moment, developers are sitting, tearing their hair out and twiddling their thumbs, unable to really make any dent on that market because they can't make a margin on affordable housing, and they can't build in a method which is fast enough or scalable enough to drive those costs down. And so with this workforce that we're creating, the research capacity that we've got and the design build service that we've created, we're trying to position all of that to develop a prefabricated housing solution that we can scale to build in hopefully hundreds of thousands of housing units. So the first pillar of what I wanted to talk about was people, specifically local people. It's one of the things that I may have said before in the early days of Orkidstudio, but I didn't really realize the power of truly engaging and having your peers as local people from the places and the communities where you're actually working. When Orkidstudio was positioned in the UK and we were going out to projects, we were engaging community. We were doing participatory design, or we were employing local people. And we were trying to listen. And there's a lot of things that are really great about that. But when I first started hiring Kenyans or East Africans into Orkidstudio, I could never really have quite comprehended the influence that those people would have had on our work. It goes far beyond just listening to people that you're building for. It becomes a completely inherent part of your practice, that those people are able to talk about things that I will never have a perspective on. I know Kenya, I've lived there for a few years, I've been going for 11 or 12, but I'll never know Kenya in the way that the staff that I have here do, or the team that I have around me. But we also need to do more. We need to do more to try and train these young people in better design. I have a lot of talented designers or engineers or construction people in my team, but a lot who've not had the same exposure to projects or to study that I've had, for example. And so we do some in-house training. We're beginning to bring on more and more local interns and graduates from the universities. But we also started working with the African Design Center, which is a program based in Kigali that is training at a postgraduate stage designers in how to actually develop local solutions for the built environment. And so we started employing some of their graduates and found some of the ideas that have come in to be really quite exciting. Sorry, I need to go back again. We also need to train, as I mentioned before, the artisans. We need to train the people that are going to build our buildings, because there's no use in having a great design that results in a building that will collapse during construction. So before I get onto that in detail, I want to tell you a story about Helen. Helen changed everything for Orkidstudio. She changed everything for me. She's, apart from my wife, I should probably say, she's the most inspiring woman that I've ever met. Helen was, or is, representative of a lot of women in Kenya. She has had a very, very low income. She was earning less than $3 a day. Most days she couldn't even get work. She had 8 children, and she was only 28 when I met her. She'd never had an education, and she didn't own the land or the house that she lived in. So there was really no way for Helen to make any real difference to her life. At the time that I met her, we were working on this project, a children's home in Nakuru in Kenya. And Helen lived just literally opposite the driveway entrance there on a small plot of rented land. And she came up to the site gate one day and said to me, I would love to learn the skills that you're teaching the men on your site. And we had a completely male workforce. For no other reason than we just simply hadn't thought about it or asked. We'd said, who is experienced in building in this community? And it was all men that came forward. And I said to Helen, well, look, you're not going to volunteer. You're going to come on the site and we'll pay you the same as we're paying the men. I just need one simple thing from you, and that's commitment. So Helen went away, came back the next day, did a great job. To cut a long story short, by the end of the first week, Helen had twisted my arm and got 12 of her friends on the project, which I think is great. And by the end of the project, those 13 women were more highly skilled, they were harder working, we trusted them more, and they were more reliable than any of the men that we had on our site. But even more exciting than that, the men started to catch up pretty quick. So it made a change. At the time, we didn't really know how to teach. We didn't know how to actually teach people to be better builders. So we started in a fairly simple way. We made some booklets for the earth bag technique that we were using on this particular project that relied more or less minimally on any written language. A lot of these women couldn't read or write. And so it was all done with diagrams and an illustrator to explain how to do this process, and we distributed these booklets to the women and the men on the project and used this as a learning tool as they built the building. Helen then decided to get the 13 or her group of 12 friends together to help her build a house. So she spoke with us, and we decided that we would buy her a plot of land that she could own, and that we would help put together a simple design that these women could build based on the techniques that they'd already learned. And it was one of the most interesting experiences for me. I went and project managed this particular site, and I didn't really project manage. I didn't give any orders, didn't give any instructions. I sat back and I said, you guys do it, you know what to do. And they did, but of course there were times where they didn't have the confidence, or they didn't always believe or know the right answer, or maybe they just didn't agree with each other on different things. And I would sit and I would just look and say, well, no, you guys get on with it. And sometimes site would stop for 6 hours whilst they fought and they, decided and came to an agreement. But at the end of it, they got a building built. The only times I interfered, I'll say, is when health and safety was maybe a bit shaky. And they built this very, very modest 2-bedroom house for Helen and her family. It still stands today. The bags are now plastered. She's done quite a lot of extra work to it. But moreover, she has a plot of land that she can generate a sustainable income from. So Helen now earns 5 times the amount that she earned when I met her 5 years ago. She has a garden where she grows and sells vegetables and fruit. And she also has picked up a range of other jobs, including once or twice the odd small construction job. She's also, from that income, paid us back the full amount of the land and the house. And that was the most important and the most exciting thing for us. And one of the things that I learned during the first 8 years of doing this work was that although charity or philanthropic money definitely has a place in certain projects and in certain parts of the world, so often it doesn't, and it actually creates more damage. And by asking Helen simply to pay us back, we weren't particularly worried about the money. I'd have happily bought Helen a land and some house out of my own pocket if I could. But it made such a difference to her mentality, her attitude towards this house. She worked so much harder. Her friends gathered around her, worked so much harder, and she worked tooth and nail to build a business around the agriculture that she's got on site to be able to do that. That's her filling out her repayment form. Since Helen and her 12 friends, we continued. We thought, well, this is a fantastic thing. And these women are able to help us in a way deliver our work at a better quality. And so since that period, over the last 5 years, we've created jobs for just over 1,500 women, which has made up about 52% of the total workforce that we've employed in that time. This is some of them on one of the particular projects. But in all cases, we found, although we were experiencing the same things, we were experiencing better skill level eventually, we were experiencing more reliability, more trust, and so on. A lot of these women were not having the same experience as Helen. We didn't go and build all of them houses. A lot of these women were going back to the way of life that they'd had before. Maybe a little bit more confidence, maybe some construction skills, but who was going to give them an opportunity in construction in a country that is very prejudiced against women, and in an industry which globally is very prejudiced against women? And so, as a result, just in the last year, we've launched a new program called Build Her, which I'll explain a little bit to you now. Sorry, double clicking again. So Build Her is a targeted, curriculum-driven, and accredited training program based in Nairobi for low-income earning women just like Helen. And the big difference here is that when we were working on site and training on the job, we were unable to deliver a curriculum-based education. We were unable to give an accreditation, a piece of paper that said you are actually qualified, and therefore we were unable to help those women get into jobs. Build Her is trying to change that and ensure a lasting impact and legacy for these women. So the women that we're working with are between 18 and 35 years old. They're, like Helen, earning less than $3 a day when they join the program. And we find that they're typically uneducated or semi-educated, maybe had to drop out of primary or early secondary school. In many cases, we often find, just like Helen, they are mothers, quite young, and almost always single mothers. The number of single mothers in Kenya is absolutely huge. It's bigger than any other African country I've been to. The training pathways that we're educating them in at the moment are carpentry and specialist finishes. Specialist finishes is things like painting, plastering, ceiling work, gypsum board, that sort of thing. And we're also integrating that with a pretty broad range of life skills education, things like basic business and finance, confidence and leadership skills, gender-based violence awareness and sexual health and family planning, conflict resolution, these sorts of things. We're recruiting these women through community-based organizations. So we've partnered up with organizations that have a long-standing track record in these communities. They know the households, they know these women well, and that they would be suitable for the program. And we also deliver the curriculum in collaboration with them. We get their feedback, and we also get the feedback and input of the industry, of the employers, to make sure that when these women graduate, there actually will be jobs for them and that their skills will be what the expectation is of the industry. Also quite interesting, and it goes back to the point I made about Helen and repaying her house, is how we've chosen to structure the finances. So education in most parts of the world, or in certainly this part of the world, tends to be free at some level, and then you have to pay for it. In Kenya, that's still the case in many respects, but a lot of these women can't access even free education. If they need to look after the children, if they need to be out earning money, and they have no other father figure or other responsible adult able to help them, a free education sounds great, but it's not going to help. So at Build Her, what we've done, and this is completely unique in Kenya now, I'm hoping other people will pick up on it and we can scale this to other institutions, but we're paying each woman for every day that she comes to the program. So she gets a stipend, similar to what she would earn, but with more stability. So she gets $3 a day, just as she did when she came onto the program. But she has the stability of knowing that she's got that for 4 months of intensive training at our training center in Nairobi. She then gets put on an 8-month placement with an industry partner who pays her a better wage of about $5 or $6 a day to work on their project or their site. And during that, she makes a very small deduction from her salary and pays back to Build Her to cover the stipend that she originally received. At the end of the year, she sits her trade exam, gets her certificate, and we help her get a job where her income can be anything between about $10 and $15 a day, which is a 3 to 5-fold increase in what she was earning. As I say, we're seeing a lot of these women having competitive advantage, and we're trying to pick industries that we ourselves have experienced are low supply, high demand areas in the Kenyan market, and hoping that this will not just help Orkidstudio, but also a wide range of other employers. We're trying to impact livelihoods, as I said, but we're also trying to do other things. We're trying to create future leaders, women who have confidence, not necessarily just in construction, but to do anything that they may wish to do, and also to have a say in how cities like Nairobi develop. The moment anybody who's making policy about cities, anybody who's making any decisions is completely male. Half of, or less than in Kenya, less than half of the population given a voice in how we develop our cities. We're also trying to impact on children, making sure that through the increased income, these women are able to put their kids into better childcare, they're able to get their kids better meals and so on. And then to the point I did briefly mention earlier, and in some ways I find one of the most exciting, we are seeing huge change in male attitudes. On the sites where we've had these women, to 50% of our workforce, we're finding that the men on site go through a bit of a phase, bit of a transition. First, they think it's one big joke. Then they start to get a little bit threatened. And then they start to realize, they get a bit smart, and they think, well, if I help her, the boss will like me, and and it will be really good. And then eventually, I believe they are building a newfound respect for the women that they're working with. And although I can't prove this at the moment, one of the things that I'm really interested in measuring is, can this change? Do things like reduce incidences of gender-based violence? Can it give women more control over when they start a family or how many children they have? So from there, as I say, we're taking a lot of the employees at the moment, and we've also built various partnerships with local companies that are excited to get women into their workforce. It would be amazing if Kenya could be a global leader in the number of women that it has in the workforce. There is only 6% of the Kenyan workforce which are female in construction. Most of those are in clerical or support roles on site. And in the world, there's nowhere higher than 15% in the construction industry. It's the most male-dominated sector in the world. So we have local people. We also need local solutions, which of course come from those local people. I want to first talk about this interesting image here. One of the staff members in my team, a young Kenyan architect called Matamu Kalilo, incredibly talented young guy. He has been developing in his own time a product using mycelium, which is a type of mushroom that grows rapidly, literally overnight, between some form of aggregate. So you could use things like, he's using the husk of a corn cob, for example, as one of these aggregates just chopped up. And you can form it into almost any single shape. This is a small container, but he started to look at making them into sheets for paneling, ceilings, that sort of thing, and also into bricks. Once you bake it, the mushroom bacteria dies, and it forms a very solid and robust brick. It's still in development phase. This is not something we can build from just yet, but it is happening in other parts of the world as well. But it's a very exciting innovation that he's developed specifically for the Kenyan market, and just shows some of the interesting ideas and inspiring ideas that are happening at the ground. That said, what is happening right now isn't great. I've already shown some images of stone and concrete buildings, but what about modern buildings in Kenya? Well, this is what we've got. We have buildings built out of glass on the equator. And we have big black boxes on the equator. These two buildings, I spoke to teams that worked on these, and the strategy for keeping these buildings cool and dignified and nice spaces to be in was just to air condition them. Now, if anybody has been to countries on the equator and seen good examples of architecture, there may be certain instances where you need to air condition a building, but you really don't. You can use passive systems. You can simply design for the climate, but a lot of these buildings are cookie cutter examples from other parts of the world that have not got the same climate and conditions as us. I'm going to talk now about a project that Orkidstudio has been working on. It's the one that Bea mentioned at the beginning. This is in Zambia, and then I'll come back round to Kenya. But it's an example in a particular location of what I would consider to be much more appropriate design. So this is Zambia here, quite a large country, very, very low density population, but also growing. As a result, there's very, very poor infrastructure. You can see the major roads through Lusaka down to Livingstone where the Victoria Falls are, and up through this region, which is known as the Copper Belt, big mining area. Our hospital is nowhere near any roads or any roads that Google knows, and it's all the way up on the DRC border near to Angola. It's a small town up there which takes about 12 hours to get from the nearest bigger town that has things like supermarkets and hardware stores and a lot of the critical things that you would need to not just build but also run a hospital. And it's a community that have set up there off the back of a mission, Christian mission that established itself in the 50s, that has built a community around this lake where they have a hydro dam that was built in the 70s, so they're quite self-sufficient, as you'd have to be up there. And they have a whole community living around them. Beyond this, at a slightly bigger scale, there are lots of rural, smaller communities. The immediate catchment area for this hospital is about 10,000 people, but it goes even beyond that, a number that I can't quantify, partly because of the bordering to countries like DRC, where they don't take consensus data. But we have at this hospital a lot of cases coming in where people have walked for 10 days or have traveled on the back of a motorbike for 10 days. Now, bear in mind that if you're going to make that trip and you're going to come to hospital in this part of the world, you're not an outpatient. You're not coming because you've got a bit of a runny nose. You're coming because it's an emergency situation. A lot of these people arrive on death's doorstep or, in many cases, sadly, don't make the trip. It's a pretty beautiful place in many ways. This is the dam I was talking about. Very basic buildings and infrastructure. In many ways, a bit of a paradise. Not necessarily in keeping with the way that people live. They've had a healthcare centre there since the early 60s, which has been added onto over the years. And so this is what we found originally. And some parts of it weren't all that bad. Parts of these buildings, they were in good shape, not necessarily hospital buildings, but they were reasonable. Other parts of it were pretty dreadful. These were the main showers and toilets for the inpatient wards, which were also, accessed from the outside and dreadful when you got there. So when we reached here, we'd originally been asked to come along and just build a small extra ward space. And we thought, well, if we add more ward space, well, then we have to add a whole lot of other things. And at what point do we just create more burden for a healthcare facility that really can't cope with what it's receiving anyway? And so we decided to take a slightly more radical approach and instead decided to turn what was a rural health centre into a primary level hospital, which could accommodate about 80 people and up from about 20 or 30 at this time. Thereby also garnering significant extra government support, which is a challenge in itself. But to the design, one of the big challenges was, well, where do we get our materials? We're 12 hours away from the nearest hardware store, and it's not just about the time, it's also the roads. The roads were impassable for half of the year, and the rest of the year it was just very, very long, huge delays, big cost, not to mention carbon impact that we would have had. And so we set about, with no little effort, to design a building which was as much built from what we could find on the site or within a set radius, which we set at 10 kilometers. And so we managed to achieve a building which has got 84.4% of material by volume sourced locally. And the way that we've done that has primarily been through two materials, timber and earth. So we were fortunate that in the 50s and 60s, the mission had planted a pine forest. The rest of the timber in that area is indigenous hardwood and not so sustainable. And we were able to fell that forest and saw planks to create things like our formwork timbers and our scaffolding and that sort of thing. We've since replanted the forest to double the acreage that we took, and that will hopefully serve a new generation later. We were also able to take the timber from the original health centre, which we demolished. So all of the windows, doors, the roof rafters was beautiful 30-odd, 40-odd old hardwood from the local area. And we were able to plane a lot of that down to turn into our doors, windows, and some furniture. And then the earth we were able to take from literally the surrounding site. We've got these incredible sort of 10-meter tall anthills that have got incredibly strong clay soil that we compressed into interlocking earth bricks and built not only the walls but also these large vaulted roofs over the hospital. So I'll touch on this just briefly. We also did quite a lot to understand how do we actually build a hospital in this part of the world. What do people actually want from a hospital? And this is one of the areas. This was before I started employing a lot of local staff, but it was one research project that a student of mine from the Mackintosh School of Architecture helped run. Where he basically looked at what are the social structures around healthcare, particularly inpatient and maternity care, for people in that community. And we were able to break it down into 5 key areas, 5 key concerns. One was supportive social structure. So it became evident to us that these communities relied hugely on who could actually support them whilst they were at hospital. Most people were coming from a very long distance, not necessarily always 10 days, but even a day's journey would have been a relatively short distance to come to the hospital. They needed people that were supportive, a husband or a family member that would come along with them and make their meal for them whilst they were there, that would care for them and give them support. At a slightly higher level, we found social rule systems were a major influencer. Do people even trust Western healthcare? There were major taboos about it. Some families that would not let their loved one, their sick loved one, go to hospital. There were patients that would come having broken away from the home deliberately because they wanted healthcare, but knowing that their family or the community around them wouldn't accept it. How do we get around that? How can design even begin to play a role in some of those issues? Concealment. And this one I found quite interesting. During birth, for example, men are not allowed anywhere near in this culture. But as soon as the birth has happened, everybody is allowed to flood the maternity wing for a massive party, which stresses the nurses out a little bit. And so there's big issues around concealment and who can see into the room and how do we get natural light into the room while still providing privacy. Accessibility as well. How do people get to the hospital? Can they drive? Are they going to come on the back of a motorbike? There's no ambulance. The roads are dreadful. And then the environment, the physical space around them. A lot of the patients that we spoke to or the community said that they didn't like elements of the existing hospital because it didn't make them feel a certain way. Maybe it was to do with the light level or the temperature. The wards were too hot. We found patients sitting outside on the dirty floor underneath a tree because it was cooler than in the inpatient wards. So how do we design better wards where people don't feel the need to go out? And so this started to inform the strategy that we took. Partly, and I mentioned this earlier, that we were upgrading to this first level hospital where we could get more support, more equipment, invest more money. Building staff capacity, we teamed up with an Edinburgh-based organisation called Global Emergency Medicine, who have rolled out a 5-year training programme with the medical staff there, as well as doing work to sensitise the community towards Western medicine and looking at some of the access routes to the hospital and addressing some of those points that I mentioned earlier. And then enhancing quality, really focusing on design and involving the community in how we designed and built that building to get something that was hopefully more reflective of what they aspired to. And so this is this was taken last year, almost complete building. We haven't got sort of final photos of it yet. Some of the interior spaces. So we're still trying to work on getting equipment and furniture for the full hospital, but these are some of the ward spaces with beds that will look directly out to a view. And then we have different strategies around the windows in terms of blinds and different levels and flower beds that help obscure views in and so on and add that privacy. And then just creating cool circulation around the site using perforated walls to allow air to flow. And the whole hospital bar very highly clinically controlled spaces like the operating theatre or some of the labs is all passively ventilated and all achieving the WHO standards for air change rates just through passive ventilation. I'll briefly talk about a couple of other projects simultaneously here that we're doing in the Nairobi area. And these are projects where, again, we're thinking in a different context, how can we come up with different solutions, local solutions that challenge the way things are being done. I've already mentioned that most buildings are made out of concrete and stone and that somehow at some point that needs to change. However, it's not going to change overnight. There's no immediate option available on the market, and although we're working hard and keeping our ears to the ground for other ideas to try and change that, maybe we need to just start with saying, well, how do we build better and more efficiently with those materials of concrete and stone? And so We have two projects here. One is Kibera Girls Soccer Academy, which is an organization working in Kibera slum in the southern part of the city here. It's one of Africa's largest slums. And it's a permanent structure, which in itself is unusual for that area, that will run this academy, both academic as well as sports, for girls in the area. And then the Yaramal Mission Center, which is a Roman Catholic organization doing a lot of outreach and community work in terms of education and training programs. And they're based a little bit south, just over the county line in a slightly more rural site of the city. And so, as you can see, the Kibera one's got a whole range of buildings that we sort of tried to map out. They're all single-story structures, tin sheet, very informal. They've got two L-shaped buildings already on the site, two-story classroom blocks made out of timber and tin, very uncomfortable during the day, quite hot. And so the vision that the organization has is to build this sort of three-story with an occupied roof building here. Whilst they continue to use this, then they'll demolish the other side and expand. And our brief really was to provide dormitory spaces and educational spaces in this building, which we've done, but we've also brought in other ideas, like we have a ground floor football pitch, probably only 3-on-3 or 4-on-4. It's a fairly tight site. And on the top, we have a basketball, volleyball, netball court. As well. So trying to change the way that play happens in this sort of environment. At the moment, and over the last 10 years that the organization's been running, the girls have to go on a very, very long walk to get to anywhere they can actually kick a football around. So hopefully this will change things a little. And then the Yaramal site, which is a much more rural site, but completely covered with trees. And so we've developed a design which tries to weave around and respond a little bit more to these trees. And the reason why we're doing this, even though it might seem like a fairly obvious solution, is that in Kenya, you never save the tree, is how most people develop buildings. In fact, when we ask our surveyors, topographic surveyors, to survey the site, they come back with contours and no trees. And we say, well, we need the trees. And they have no idea how to survey a tree. So we have to go there with them and work out. And they think it's all done when you've got the trunks. And we say, oh, no, but we need the canopies as well now. And all this sort of thing. And it's a mentality that in some ways needs to change. It's indicative of the society much more widely. I recently found that only 4% of people that visit conservation areas are Kenyan. Now, obviously, we've got a lot of tourism, but it's a real problem when you consider that very few Kenyans are actually engaging in conservation or in the natural landscape. Even Nairobi, which is an incredibly green city, is declining in the amount of greenery that it's got every year. So on these two projects, we've tried to develop structures which are incredibly minimal in the amount of concrete, and a bit more efficient in the way that they use stone. So simple techniques such as, I don't actually have a photo of it here, but on the KGSA building, the Kibera Girls Soccer Academy, we're using recycled oil drums cut in half to create a single span slab, a bit like a waffle slab, but without the sort of counter direction, to save on the amount of concrete, to think differently about how we use formwork as well, using things that we can reuse that don't wear out as quickly as plywood or other forms of sheet material. And then laying the stone much more efficiently. Normally, when you see a stone wall in Kenya, it has about 50 millimeters of cement mortar between each block. And so just training artisans on site and showing what it means to do something at a much finer 10 mil pointed joint. We've also done things on Yaramal. The Kibera project goes on site in the next couple of weeks. Yaramal's a bit further ahead, so I have better photos of that. But looking at things like rotating bricks out a little. And on this particular project, we've done that on the walls that face significant sun exposure every day. So we're just slightly increasing the amount of surface area on the wall, providing a little bit of shading to the brick below, and trying to keep the space inside a little bit cooler. And then just generally trying to design spaces which are healthier, which are more dignified, which you actually want to spend time in, that are light. The building that had already been built on this site before the client came to us, they'd already started the project with a different architect, is incredibly dark, brand new building, and you go into all these rooms and you almost can't even take a photo. It's almost pitch black in the middle of the day. And then the third example is this project here by Penda Health. Now, Penda Health is a healthcare organization which is trying to provide very, very low cost healthcare to communities much like the ones that the women from Build Her are coming from. Now, healthcare centres cost a lot. Sachibondu was quite a simple one, but it still cost a fair amount of money. And at the moment, it's not always viable to build new buildings, particularly in a city where land price is between $1 and $5 million US an acre. To build low-cost, affordable healthcare centres is very, very difficult. And so Penda Health have developed an idea of saying, well, why don't we take spaces in these buildings, these concrete and stone buildings that are mostly residential blocks, and turn them into health clinics until such time as we can develop a better healthcare infrastructure more widely. And so we work with Penda Health to survey buildings. For every building that they build in, we normally survey anything between sort of 3 and 6 that get discarded because they're maybe not going to fall down, but we're not certain. And then finally find one that maybe is fairly well built. But this might give you a slight sense. This is the survey that was, this is the final design based on our survey. This is the design that the landlord has for how the building was built. Now, they're similar, but if you can see, they're not exactly, this is a little bit different to this, and so on. And so we're finding, when we go into these buildings, no wonder some of them are falling down or the spaces don't work, because the contractor gets this and builds this. Something very, very different to what he was actually commissioned to do. And it's remarkable how many times we see this. We see buildings that are twice the size as what the actual drawing said. And that sort of lack of regulation can cause a lot of problems. So trying to cram the program of an outpatient clinic into this slightly ad hoc space is certainly a challenge, but one that we're enjoying. We've done now about 6 or 7 clinics, and there's going to be another 12 or 15 this year. So they're spreading like wildfire across Nairobi, which is very exciting. Inside, they're incredibly simple, but essentially clean. They're light. We've focused a lot on how do we get more light into the buildings. So we're often breaking through some of the stone facades, opening up new windows, and just creating a space which hopefully is much nicer to be in. Again, even in the waiting rooms, how do we create spaces that are enjoyable to sit, maybe whilst you're worried or thoughts going through your head at the time. So I've talked about local people and local solutions, and the last thing I was going to touch on is scale, and this is certainly the shortest bit because it's also the biggest challenge. It's the thing that we're wrangling with at the moment. We've had some exciting opportunities recently. As Bea said, our organisation has grown a fair bit in terms of the number of people, but that's largely because of a few projects that we're now excited to be working on. We've had a client who saw Sachibondu and wants to develop a 500-bed specialist hospital in one of the big towns of Kenya. Of course, not in the same way. It wouldn't make sense. But they're starting to ask the question, and this is a Kenyan client, which is what excites me the most. They're asking, well, how can we actually build hospitals differently in Kenya? There's a few good hospitals, but most of them have relied on imported materials, mostly from places like Dubai and so on. And so they're asking, well, how do we build a world-class, major 500-bed facility using local ideas and local people? And we're in very early stages, but that's something that is exciting us a lot. And we also have another client that we're working with, a Kenyan guy and a British guy, that have come together to develop a new approach to affordable housing in Nairobi, saying, well, why does everybody have to live in stone and concrete buildings? Can we build initially in something like compressed earth? Can we do that at scale, at story height? Can we build them faster, more effectively, at a cheaper cost? But also protect things like basic dignity of space. Make sure that these spaces are well lit, are naturally ventilated. The amount of developments, modern, new developments, some better built than the examples I've shown here in Nairobi at the moment, have rooms in them that have got no access to natural light or air. We had a project the other day come in for construction only. A different architect had done the design, which we don't often do, but we were looking at this one. And there were a whole load of rooms that had absolutely no windows in them. And we've turned them away and said, we'll build it if you come back with a design that people would actually want to live in. And so a lot of this comes back to educating local people, but also understanding that there's a real talent that exists there, and there's a lot of local solutions that are growing up, whether through that hospital or through the housing or through other ventures that we may try to launch and start over the coming years. The way that we're thinking, the way that we want Orkidstudio to go is not just how do we build the odd school, how do we build the odd health centre, which will make a big difference to that community, but how do we completely transform the way that Nairobi operates or the way that Kenya looks in 30 years' time. I'm a resident of Nairobi. I absolutely love it. Traffic is dreadful. It's somewhere between 3 and 10 million people, depending on which statistic you read. But in 30 years, when it's doubled, and then probably some again in the city, I'm not sure I'd want to live there the way it's going. And I think that's the scariest thing. And so we're trying to create a city that I would like to live in, and that my colleagues would like to live in, and that hopefully everybody else would love to live in. So I think that's the end. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, James. This was absolutely terrific, fantastic presentation. We now like to introduce a panel to explore some of the topics that James tickled our curiosity with, and also involve the audience in the conversation. Can I introduce Heinz Richardson? Heinz is the Chief Executive of Jessica Wiles, who's given us the space tonight and has been working in architecture for several decades, and I'm sure has some interesting things to contribute. And we also have with us Bo Tang. Bo is a senior lecturer at London Metropolitan University, and her work there is very much focused on international development and novel methods of design and construction in India and West Africa. So, to go, I have one thought, unless somebody else would like to start.
Well, can I just say something? Because I think it's really interesting, you know, to have so many people in our office, and what thrills me more than anything is there's so many young people in our office listening to this incredible inspirational speech. And the work that's going on through Orkidstudio is absolutely inspirational. And I think, you know, there are so many challenges, so many issues that you raise through the work that you're doing, which apply across the world. They're not just that place, you know. We struggle with the same things in so-called civilized society. You know, the attitudes and the issues and the responses that you may are absolutely fantastic, but we struggle with them. And what worries me a little bit about it is that how do we stop the world that is developing, and the issue around cities that you were talking about is absolutely key in a way. How do we as influencers, architects, planners, whatever, journalists, address these issues? Because it seems to me there is the education issue that you touched on is critical, but there's also a huge desire for many people to want to live the way we live, and the way we live is not sustainable. And what you're talking about is a fundamentally sustainable way of approaching things. So I don't know, I have a question actually. I don't know whether I should address a question, but sure. I just thought I'd say that because I think the issues are so critical, and they are literally important everywhere. throughout the world that we occupy. But the question I have, there is a question. I mean, you know, you've told us some wonderful tales about all the brilliant things that you're doing, but I'm sure behind that there's a huge amount of blood, sweat, resistance to change, and all of that. And how do you deal with the sort of systems, the authorities, all the things that you have to challenge to be able to do what you're doing? Is it easy or is it hard? I'm sure it's not easy, but what sort of lessons have you learned? Do you have to be bullish? Do you have to, you know?
Yeah, you definitely have to be bullish. I think it's hard work, but I would say that building any sort of change or business is, I'm sure, hard work anywhere in the world. One of the things that we find is that we're working in a very under-regulated part of the world, and in some ways, and I think often at the detriment of certain initiatives, that is a very easy thing to abuse, that lack of regulation. There's examples of projects that we've seen that have truly done that, and I think that undermines the system. What we try to do, although it can be incredibly frustrating at times, is even just with planning or building control, and really there's no distinction in Kenya, and there's not really any building control. But we try and go through those processes, even though the institutions that are administering those processes are themselves not interested in the process and are trying essentially to get some sort of payoff in order to get the project through. And so we have, you know, the project I showed here in Kibera has been going to site for best part of a year and a half, 2 years now. And I just said it's going to site in a few weeks. Well, I'm as optimistic as I've ever been, but it's an example of a project that we've just had to keep stalled the whole time because the planning authority in that area are trying to leverage the project for a bribe that we or the client are not prepared to pay. So at some point, you know, it would have been easier for us to have paid it. We'd have, you know, would have been a nice project to have had then. We've had to wait for it. But hopefully by standing our ground on those things, we can make some difference, I hope. But I think it's going to take I think these things take a long time to change.
So then do you think there's any scope to work with, you know, the people at the top, like the local authorities and, you know, the contractors, you say, all the people who are generally seen as being corrupt, to help change this, you know, way that things are working? I mean, it seems to me that a lot of what you're doing is sort of avoiding that and doing it just the way you can do it, you know, by training people yourself rather than using contractors, that sort of thing. But at some point when you scale up, you almost have to work with these people and try and help them change. I mean, give them that motivation to do it the right way. Quality, you kept mentioning, isn't a big issue, and that's all tied in with regulation and with contractors and the way they work. Yeah.
No, I think there's a number of ways that we're trying to do that. I'm not sure that we're trying to avoid some of those issues, although certainly at times to get anywhere you need to find a certain way of doing it. But a big part of it goes back to the people that we're employing. By employing, I mean our team's 80% Kenyan. And so I'm hoping, you know, as much as I'd like to keep hold of them all because they're great, I in many ways want them to go to other practices, to spend a few years with us, to hopefully learn a different way of approaching things and then go somewhere else. And I also see Build Her as a huge part of our position and influence at a public level, not least in the strength and the voices of the women that will go out into the industry, but also because we're beginning to lay the groundwork, at least, for partnerships with governments to try and get some of the curriculum and the model of Build Her into the public TVET institutions. By strengthening those relationships, hopefully have a wider impact on the construction industry and build influence that way. But I think it's a long-term play.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think Build Her is a really quite ambitious but very important thing that you're doing. More widely than just, say, the people working or being trained or working very closely with the women, how has it been received, you know, culturally, you know, by the male, let's say, population. You touched briefly on the male workers who are in construction and how they feel about working alongside women, but wider than that, where there may be some naivety from people. How have you sort of gotten quite a sense of negative response, or?
There have been, not so much on our building sites, although more so with other employers, because they don't necessarily have the experience themselves as an employer to enforce or to create a more gender equal environment. So we've started doing a lot of work now with the employers to create more female-friendly work sites. First of all, we make sure that the women are always not just one woman going to work with a bunch of men. It would always be a small group at least. But we work with the employer to do things like make sure that there's proper welfare facilities, that they've actually got things like a sexual harassment policy and they know how to enforce it. And we do toolbox talks or sort of briefings with the male labourers on their site and their staff to get them to understand why we're doing this and some of the issues and so on, and also provide the women with mentors so that they have, and also support groups. They work within groups of 15 to 20 women to provide other forms of support to each other. So we're doing a lot of that work. I think where we have seen maybe more resistance sometimes is from husbands of those women. As I say, a majority are actually single mothers, so we don't have so many issues there. But in certain instances, the husband, when she starts earning more, that becomes a problem. And we've had some instances where the husband has forced her to no longer work. That said, in some cases where that's happened, we had actually one woman who was part of the original 13 on that project, and she started working for us in our office in Nairobi. This was a young woman who'd not hadn't completed primary school training, and we gave her a job in the procurement team in our office. And she survived with us for about a year, did incredibly well. Her rate of learning was more than I could have imagined. But then her husband wouldn't allow her to continue. And so she's now back in Nakuru. But I spoke to her the other day actually, and she's used a lot of the confidence and the skills that she's bought to set up a business with him that he's bought into. And it's not in the same thing she was doing. It's small scale retail in her village, but she's kept a decent salary and her life is definitely different. So I think that hopefully we're embedding and instilling different skills that can go beyond some of those prejudices, and then hopefully in time, the moment builder's fairly young, and that's where the real impact is. But if we can train the tens of thousands of women that we're aiming to train, then maybe we start to change a lot of those issues as well.
Sorry, I have lots of questions. I haven't seen James in about 5 years, so we're just catching up really. No, I mean, it's interesting to me because when we did last meet, you were sort of still lecturing at Glasgow. You had, Orkidstudio is very small. You were very sort of hands-on, doing the projects yourself with volunteers and everything else. So, in 4 years, your organisation has sort of expanded at a very fast rate. I suppose my question is, do you feel, and if so, what kind of compromises do you think you've had to make along the way to the ethos or the way that you work or the process of carrying out these projects?
That's a good question. I think that there's been certain things that have been deliberate, and you might not necessarily see them as compromises, but one that I'll mention first was when we started Orkidstudio. We did a project first in Uganda, then we went to Bolivia in South America, then at some point we were in Cambodia and various other African countries in between. And it was exciting, it was great. I got some pretty good travel as a result of it, but I found that every time we would go to a new place, we were resetting everything that we knew. We were just novices again, right at the beginning of a project. And that started to get a little bit frustrating. We weren't seeing, we might see some impact, but were we really making a change on that community? And so although we still do selective projects further afield in Kenya, 80+% of the projects now are in Nairobi or very easily commutable from Nairobi. And although we'd like to have a bigger impact on the whole of Kenya, I think even if, taking on Nairobi is more than a lifetime's work. So in that sense, I think there's been a deliberate compromising, or maybe that's not the right word, but sort of reducing of the ambition in that sense, but scaling the ambition in a different way. And then I think just the other thing to touch on is 3 years ago, we although we still have our non-profit charity that does projects like Sachibondu, we also have the company in Kenya is a for-profit, and the purpose is not really profit, but it's more about keeping something that doesn't constantly rely on going and asking people for money, but that can keep growing and sustaining its growth. And we've been very successful in that respect, but at times we have to take on projects that are just about paying the bills, and not always the most social. That said, that's given me a different perspective, and I find it interesting, and not in any way to criticize, but I find it interesting when I was living in the UK and existing in that sort of social or human-centered design space, and it was almost this niche, it was a separate thing, and the way that it was published or not published in the media reinforced that. And when I went and started actually living in Nairobi, I realized almost every project is has some element of social impact, even if it's for a corporate company or something like that. It's all part of growing the economy and the infrastructure, and if we can then select and partner with some of those bigger, more influential organizations where there's a clear value alignment, and we can do things like getting women into jobs on some of these projects, the building itself doesn't always have to serve a poor community. It's great when it does, but it doesn't always have to in order for it to have real, tangible impact. And so I think, again, that's at times a compromise, but it's also just a shift in perspective.
No, just to respond to that, I think it was clearly a wise move to focus all the attention on Nairobi in one place, and very commendable, because actually part of the appeal to a lot of young architects and working in this field is the ability to travel.
Yeah.
And that that's in a way sometimes a negative thing, because it sort of leads to people seeing this kind of work as development tourism, and that sort of negative sort of association with what is essentially good intentions. We get asked this a lot from our students, but what would your advice be to people wanting to essentially follow in your footsteps?
I get that a lot. I would say you don't always have to travel. There's, as Heinz said, there's some of these issues on your own doorstep that you're probably actually far better equipped to tackle because you know about them. Even if it isn't quite as sexy, let's say, as traveling to Cambodia or to Kenya. If you are, set on that, I wouldn't discourage it. I just think there's different ways of doing it, and I think a big part of it is committing for longer than a short, 1 month laying some bricks. I think that, whenever you go, no matter what you tell yourself or what the organization tries to tell you, if you're there laying some bricks, someone else hasn't got a job. Likewise, a lot of free projects designing from far away are taking the work away from a local architecture practice. So what could you do to strengthen local architecture practices? Maybe come and work for Orkidstudio or something like that, but I've got some friends from other parts of the world working in Kenya and Nairobi for just standard, average, high street architecture firms. And they've come in and there's nothing, their work's not published, their work doesn't have loads of books on it, they're not household names, but their influence, either on the quality of the architecture or on mentoring some of their peers around them, local graduates and so on, and they've stayed there for some years, has been huge. And I think that, I get a bit frustrated when people do it as just a short-term summer thing, but I think that if you're really committed to it, then be committed to it and move somewhere like that. Not for your whole life necessarily, like I plan to, but for a while and really make a difference.
Let's open it up a little bit to the audience. I'm sure you're dying to ask a few questions, and we'll pass the microphone around.
Hi, thank you for the talk, by the way. It was really inspiring. I actually just want to touch up on the question you both mentioned earlier, how you sort of tackled the corruption and going through the system when initially bringing this organisation to Kenya. And I have another question as well. Why Kenya?
Well, why Kenya is easy. Jaleesa, who I mentioned at the beginning, my co-founder, she's Ugandan but born and brought up in Nairobi. And so I started going to Nairobi from right at the very beginning. And I can't tell you specifically why beyond that, but it just grabbed me in a way that, as much as I love Kampala and other African cities, there's something about Nairobi. Nairobi has so many dreadful things like the traffic I mentioned and pollution and so on, but it's got an energy and a buzz. There's an entrepreneurialism there, and not just with expats. There's a lot of that as well, but there's the young Kenyan population in particular, more than I've seen in any other African state, really excite me, and they really suggest to me that the country has a much brighter future. If those people that are now relatively young in their 20s and 30s can get into positions of real influence and power over the next 30 years, and hopefully do that in a good way, I think Kenya has a very bright future. How we got through the issues initially, it's one of those things you look back on and think, oh, that was fine, but at the time it was frustrating. Nothing works, and that's part of the battle. Everything down to your personal social security registration or getting your work permit or doing anything like that is a chore and a hassle. But I think you don't question it. I think if you if you want to do this work or you're committed to a place, you just kind of find a way and put up with it somehow. Try and be optimistic.
Yes?
I think this is about what you were saying, is how transferable are these building and designs that you're doing, the type of building, like with the hospital where you're sourcing everything within a certain radius? Is that more transferable to Europe and the Americas, or does regulation get in the way? And if so, do you think that's a problem?
I think they're certainly not transferable everywhere. I mean, there are buildings that are born out of the specific nature of their place. And it's it's one of the challenges that we wrangle with, because on the one hand, we want to create architecture which is of the people, of the place, where we're responding to it in a unique way. But at the same time, we have this massive scale of challenge that we would like to solve or to address in some way. So I think that there's ways that you can do both, and maybe there need to be compromises along the way. Things like, we have a vision, and it's a plan at the moment that we're developing to deliver the prefabricated housing, factory line of housing, basically employing hopefully thousands of builder women. That's not obviously going to create housing which can respond to every single individual site in a completely unique way. But hopefully we can sit at some sort of intersection between developing methods and ideas that in their sort of core substance can be transferred, as long as, of course, you have somebody who's got the ability and the insight to be able to actually understand how to adapt it. Whether to the Americas or to Europe, I don't know. Perhaps, I mean, there's earthen construction in Europe and the US, for example, but it has to respond to different things, like different regulations. We build to Kenyan regulations and selective British standards or Eurocode. We would not be able to tick all the boxes on those anyway. Some of them don't make sense for the context, but we try and take, again, it comes back to that notion of, because it's unregulated, you also have greater responsibility. And so we try to be as responsible as we reasonably can and practicably can to hold ourselves to account on those sorts of things.
Can I just add something to that? I think that raises an interesting question, really, about what our cities are in terms of how they appear. And if you landed from outer space in Manila or LA or whatever, you would possibly struggle to know where you were, because the buildings are so anodyne, even the ones that you showed us, the glass and steel things. So what I think is interesting is if you start approaching architecture and design from the place, rather than the imposition of a technology, which is what we're doing, and you actually work with the local environment. The buildings that you've designed and created are very much rooted in their place, and that is to do with the ability, the availability of materials, it's the skills and all the rest of it. And I think one of the worst things that could happen is to just completely anesthetize all of these wonderful, fantastic opportunities that are presented by an increasing densification of urbanity by having one solution that fits all. And I think perhaps a more sustainable way of looking at it will create an architecture that is of its place and will not rely on, and we can't continue to create architecture that is sealed, signed and delivered in the sense that it's full of air conditioning and so on. So we have to change, we have to be more sustainable. And I think the lessons just at the very simple level that you've brought or bring about, that's the transferability. It's not necessarily the solutions, but it's the approach, and it's the way you go about it, and it's the thought process, and it's the all sorts of things. I mean, there's so many things that we should all be doing that are sort of encapsulated in the few projects that you've shown us that are really fascinating, I find, as a way of changing the way we do things.
There's a lot of cultural issues as well that I'd add, and I think, again, it comes back to that reason why local people are, as part of the design process, are so important. Take housing, for example. It's all stone and concrete at the moment. I would suggest that a cheaper, easier, faster, and more environmentally friendly method might be the way that we build houses in the US or here, lighter frame structures, whether timber or steel or something like that, that can be rapidly assembled and use less material. But that would never sell in Kenya at the moment, and that's one of the big challenges. There's this thing that the developers refer to as the knock effect, and the idea is that if you knock on a wall and if it makes a sound, or you can hear it on the other side, it's not a building, it's not a house. Certainly you wouldn't buy it, you'd be at pains to rent it. And so we're then committed back to these heavy earthen materials, and even earth is a great material. It's better than the stone in many ways, and it's better than concrete, but it will still, at the scale that we need to build in Kenya, in an urban context, earth, yes, to some extent, but you're going to create huge soil erosion. It's not viable in every context. It was a great solution for that hospital, but so it is, to your point, it's about multiple solutions for multiple different locations, but there's also a degree of social and behavioral change that will happen at some point, but it's going to take time.
And there's a huge educational issue and a perception issue, because many people aspire to exactly those buildings that you just said shouldn't be built. And we find the same thing. It's a big challenge in many places to get people to accept earth brick, because it reminds them of what their grandparents did, and they want to be modern. And this does not only apply to people who are grandparents now, this applies to young people as well. And looking at the more variety in how things can be done, and including that somehow in the professional education, is not happening at the moment at all. If you look at architectural schools all over Africa, the few that there are, they're all doing steel, concrete and glass. Yeah. So there's a big discrepancy between an expectation of what progress means and what it actually is being taught.
But on the subject of architectural education, because you touched on, the lack of people who are skilled in construction, architects, all of that. My limited experience of working in West Africa, we found in Sierra Leone, there were 50 architects or something in the whole country. Yeah. And the issue was, one, no architecture school, and two, those who were leaving to be educated in the US or elsewhere were not coming back. That's one of the issues. So, do you have any link with the architecture school in Kenya, and do you find a similar sort of attitude and issues there?
Yeah. We have less of a relationship than we would like. We've tried quite a number of times. We take quite a few graduates from both. There's 2 schools of architecture in Kenya, and there's certain resistance in some ways to having different ideas come into the institutions. A lot of the time it's, should be careful what I say, but a lot of the time it's because a lot of the tutors are looking to the students. A lot of the academic projects are their projects at their practice, and they're looking basically for a workforce. And so it's that again also undermines the entire educational aspect of it. That said, sorry, Bill.
We do that here.
No. That said, one of the things that I think is different to Sierra Leone, for example, is there are a lot of Kenyans coming back. There's still a lot that don't, but there's a lot that go away and get opportunities to study, because in Kenya, unlike a lot of other African countries, there's a really established middle class who can afford education either in their country or overseas, and they are coming back, which is exciting, and hopefully the numbers that do come back will keep growing.
Yes, lots of questions.
I just wanted to come back to the hospital in Zambia. I just had a couple of questions on that. Firstly, was it did you sort of reach out? Was that a country you were interested in building something out there, or did they sort of find you? How did that link happen? And secondly, you suggested that originally it was meant to be a ward, and then it sort of turned into sort of redesigning the whole place. How did that decision go about happening? And just a quick third one, how is your general funding done?
So the first one about how we made the connection, it was just word of mouth, although in this case going back some steps. So we did a project in 2011-12 in the Copperbelt region, which is 12 hours away, but in Zambian terms quite close. And through that network we heard about this, and they asked if we would come and have a look. When we got there, the idea to go for a higher level healthcare facility was ours, but in discussion with the local management and the local Ministry of Health representative. Just trying to, it was responding really to what we were hearing. They are very small, financially small entity, and had their whole history of sort of 60 odd years had been building incrementally, just as they'd never had the injection of capital that we were able to bring. And so they hadn't really considered that they could do anything different. And so it was just about bringing that different perspective. But I certainly hope anyway that we were careful not to force that on them, and we did have quite a lot of detailed discussions with them about what that actually meant. Even then, I think now they didn't quite realize what it meant, and they're now getting to grips with that, but in a positive way. And the hospital is, it will take 5-10 years before it's a hospital that is really established, but it's on the right track, which is great. And your third question? Funding. That project was run through our charity. I should say that some donations very kindly came from Jessica and Wiles, so thank you so much for that. We do fundraise through the charity, foundations, corporate groups that give us funding, and we invest. We give the time for free, and we invest in the capital cost. That said, all of our other projects now are fee for service, where we are working with other organizations, often big NGOs or social enterprises that are paying us just like any other architecture or construction firm. We try and make slightly lower margins or give them slightly better rates, but we're trying to be a sustainable business.
Pass it along afterwards. Okay, I hear we can just have a few more questions, so don't make them too long.
Hi, Jamie. So one of the things you said was about Nairobi was that nothing works. Being from Nigeria, I know some of the challenges with energy and all of those sort of things. You talk about traffic as well. What kind of is your hope or vision for the wider issues that actually affect what you're trying to do, including urban design, planning? What kind of things do you think can work?
Yeah, I think that it's very difficult. We have a lot of debates about this increasingly in the office. There is no sense of public space in a city like Nairobi. Any remotely public space that's been designed is inside the middle of a shopping mall through multiple security barriers. And that's partly because there's lack of interest at policy level, either interest or certainly impact at policy level. There's no city plan, or at least there is, but it dates back some decades and isn't followed. So there isn't, I think half the problem is that there isn't that sort of wider vision. There's some small grassroots entities in Nairobi that are trying to tackle that. I think that we struggle with how to make an impact at that level. It's what we would like to do. I think that on the one hand, if we were to do it, it's not going to sustain the organization at this stage. And so one of the approaches that we're looking at is, well, if we can gain more influence through things like being at a bigger scale, through Build Her, through affordable housing, can that give us greater power and influence to be heard at policy level? But it is worrying, not just the way the city's sprawling, and it really is sprawling at the moment, and those urban jungles that now surround Nairobi have not a single tree, whereas at least the old sort of still middle class centre of Nairobi is actually quite attractive, and that's really worrying. But I think, again, my optimism comes from, to the first question, the really young generation that are thinking differently. There's a locally created Nairobi Design Week now, which actually had its first appearance at the London Architecture Festival or Design Festival that was here recently, that's making a name for itself, that's bringing these ideas that were not there 5-10 years ago. And hopefully as those build momentum, because the African continent, and particularly African cities, have a lot of challenges, but they also have a lot of opportunity to leapfrog a lot of the development or a lot of the lessons that should have been learned or have been learned in other parts of the world. To the security point alone, one of my frustrations is that we're building Nairobi, and I know that Nigerian cities are the same, and most African cities now are building up as these compartmentalized blocks of security compounds. I live in a security compound. There's guards with guns all day, all night where I live. Every shopping mall I go into, everything. And in many ways, you can understand that when there's crime or there's terrorist threats and so on. But then if you look at other ways of doing it in other cities, if you just simply create a street and light it properly, create space which is actually more defensible, then that's a different approach. And so I think it's going to require quite radical thinking and be able to get to that big level. I don't have all the answers, just a lot of questions.
Hi James, I have 2 questions. Firstly, you touched on the business plan and how you got work or are getting work in Nairobi, but could you maybe talk a bit more about that currently and how you're getting, your networking? And the other question is related to prefab housing. And if you're going down the DFMA route, what sort of technologies are you looking into using, like CAD software? Are you using BIM, for example?
Yeah. So the first one, in terms of running a business, it's much like anywhere. I think obviously we're in a big economic hub, and that's fairly important. We pick up, we were fortunate starting up Orkidstudio as a more for-profit or social enterprise model because we already had a portfolio of work that we had developed, and in many ways that's a unique situation. But a lot of it's just been word of mouth and finding that actually a city like Nairobi, which only has, the whole country only has 131 registered architecture practices, which is, tiny. So that alone means that there's a real interest in anybody who's thinking a little bit differently. And so I think a lot of the growth that we've experienced has just been that combination of maybe right place, right time, bringing in new ideas. There's a rising sort of segment of society that are looking for those ideas at the same time. And so it's hard work to what I said at the beginning, but we're not struggling to find exciting opportunities and projects, which is great. But in many ways, the other exciting thing is that we're seeing more competition. Even in the short 3 years that we've been permanently there, new practices have sprung up, new firms, some that we may even think have copied things that we're trying to say or do, but that's great. That's what we want. Competition only drives the industry, and we're us alone. As much as I've in many ways painted a picture of sort of a lot of ambition and big things that we want to do, but there's no mistake. We will not address and solve all of those problems. Not even 2 Orkidstudios or 3. It's going to take thousands and millions of people to change it. What was your second question? Sorry.
About technology.
Yeah. So we have a great partnership with Autodesk, who help us with software, and we generally use AutoCAD, but we're now making a switch to Revit, mainly because we're doing so much bigger projects like the hospital that I mentioned. And then also looking at how we can utilize that in things like prefabrication. We're on a program at the moment being run by Habitat for Humanity in Kenya, which is it's called Shelter Tech Kenya, and it's looking for innovative technology-driven solutions to affordable housing in the East African market. So we're one of about 10 or 15 organizations that have been selected to help develop ideas, and we're the only ones doing that. There's all sorts of weird and wonderful and amazing ideas that are popping up. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we're at 8:30. This is about when we normally conclude, unless somebody has a really urgent question that must be answered.
I'll be around.
Yeah, James will circulate with his beer. And thank you very much for coming. And I hope you come to our next talk, which is about a month away. I don't know exactly where it'll be, but have a look at the website and look at social media, and we'll announce it shortly. Thank you very much.